Snow blanketed the small town of Willow Creek in Vermont, its streets hushed under the weight of winter. Max, a German shepherd with a coat as thick as the season's chill, roamed aimlessly, his presence a silent reminder of his late owner, George. The old war veteran had passed away months ago, leaving Max alone in a town that once buzzed with his quiet acts of kindness. George was not just a man. He was a protector of the town, and Max, his constant shadow, had inherited that vigilant spirit. For weeks, Max had wandered the streets, stopping at familiar places: the bench in the town square, the general store where George often chatted with the clerk, and the church steps where the two would sit after long walks. But without George, these places felt hollow. The townsfolk offered pats on the head and scraps of food, but no one could fill the void left behind. Max seemed adrift, his sharp eyes searching for something no one else could see. Then came the storm. It was the kind of blizzard that brought Willow Creek to a standstill. Families huddled indoors as winds howled through the streets, whipping snow into impenetrable drifts. On the evening before Christmas Eve, as the storm reached its peak, panic rippled through the town. Timmy Gardner, a 10-year-old boy with a knack for mischief, had gone missing. His mother, Emily, had noticed his absence just after dusk. A search party quickly formed, lanterns and flashlights cutting faint beams through the swirling snow. But the search yielded nothing. As the night deepened, hope waned. Emily stood at her front door, her breath visible in the icy air, her fingers clutching the scarf Timmy had left behind that morning. Her heart pounded with each gust of wind, imagining her boy out there alone. The storm seemed unforgiving, a wall of white that swallowed sound and sight alike. And then, out of the storm, Max appeared. The dog stood at the edge of Emily's yard, his coat dusted with snow, his amber eyes locked on hers. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Max. But tonight, something was different. Max wasn't his usual, wandering self. He barked, sharp and insistent, his body tense with purpose. Emily froze, unsure of what to make of it. "What is it, boy?" she called, her voice trembling. Max barked again, stepping closer. He stamped his paws against the snow, his movements deliberate. Emily hesitated. Could a dog really know something about her missing son? The rational part of her mind dismissed the idea, but there was something in Max's behavior that demanded attention. His urgency was palpable, almost human. Grabbing her coat and a flashlight, Emily stepped into the storm. "All right, Max, show me." Max turned and bounded down the street, looking back every few steps to ensure she was following. Emily's boots crunched against the snow as she trailed him, the cold biting through her layers. The storm was relentless, but Max moved with confidence, leading her away from the town's heart and toward the edge of the woods. The forest loomed dark and menacing, its trees heavy with snow. Emily's fear mounted. "Max, are you sure?" she murmured, her flashlight casting jittery beams across the ground. Max responded with a bark, his tail wagging in tight, determined motions. He led her to a small trailhead, barely visible under the thick snowfall. Emily knelt down, brushing snow away with her gloved hands. There, faint but unmistakable, were footprints, small and uneven, the kind a child might leave. "Timmy," Emily whispered, her heart leaping. Max barked again, louder this time, as if urging her to keep moving. Emily straightened, adrenaline surging through her veins. The footprints disappeared further into the woods, but Max didn't falter. He sniffed the air, his instincts guiding him like a compass. Emily followed, her flashlight bouncing off the trees as she plunged deeper into the forest. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wind howled around them, and Emily's breath came in short bursts. She clung to the hope that Max knew where he was going. Suddenly, Max stopped, his ears perking up. He barked once, sharply, and Emily's flashlight fell on something in the distance. A scarf caught on a low-hanging branch. She rushed forward, recognizing the pattern immediately. It was Timmy's. "Oh, thank God," she gasped, clutching the scarf to her chest. But her relief was short-lived. Where was Timmy? Max pressed on, his body low to the ground as he tracked something Emily couldn't see. The trail grew steeper, the trees denser. Emily's legs burned, but she didn't dare stop. Max's determination was infectious, and she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since Timmy's disappearance. As they crested a small hill, Max suddenly froze. His hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Emily's flashlight swept the area, landing on a small clearing. There, half buried in snow, was an abandoned sled. Emily's heart sank. The sled was Timmy's, she was certain of it. But where was he now? Max sniffed the sled, his movements cautious. Then he looked back at Emily, his eyes fierce with intent. She nodded, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "Lead the way, Mac." The dog barked once more and bounded into the night, his paws kicking up snow. Emily followed, her flashlight struggling to pierce the darkness. Behind them, the storm raged on, but Emily felt a flicker of resolve. Max wasn't just leading her, he was giving her hope. As they disappeared deeper into the woods, one question burned in Emily's mind. How did Max know? The wind roared through the towering evergreens, shaking snow from their branches like cascading powder. Emily trudged behind Max, the beam of her flashlight barely penetrating the storm's chaos. The scarf she had found moments ago was now tucked securely into her pocket, her one tangible link to Timmy. Her breath came in short gasps, each step sinking into the knee-deep snow. Max, however, moved with unwavering purpose, his body low, nose to the ground, as though following an invisible trail. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Emily's thoughts drifted to George, the dog's late owner. She'd known him only in passing, a quiet man with a distant air, always accompanied by Max. People spoke of his war service in hushed tones, hinting at acts of bravery that George never confirmed or denied. Yet, even in his silence, he had touched the lives of many in Willow Creek. Emily herself had benefited from his generosity years ago, though she had never understood why he'd chosen to help her specifically. Now, following Max through the unforgiving storm, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that George's presence lingered, not in spirit but through the bond he'd shared with this extraordinary dog. "How do you know, Max?" she murmured to herself. "What did George teach you?" Her thoughts were interrupted when Max stopped suddenly, his ears twitching. He sniffed the air, growling softly before barking twice. Emily's pulse quickened as she scanned the surroundings. The flashlight beam caught something glinting in the snow, a small, metallic object partially buried near a tree. She crouched and brushed away the snow, revealing a tin box with George's initials, GH, etched into the lid. "What is this doing out here?" she whispered, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded it with care, revealing a handwritten note in George's familiar script. "If you're reading this, you've followed Max. That means he's doing what I trained him to do. Protect this town and its people. Trust him. He'll guide you to where you need to be, even when the path seems impossible. And if you found this, you're already stronger than you think." Emily stared at the letter, her mind racing. George had trained Max to protect Willow Creek? How could he have anticipated something like this? Her thoughts tumbled, colliding with memories she hadn't revisited in years. George had been a fixture in the community, but his attention to her and Timmy had always felt inexplicable. Now, it seemed less like coincidence and more like quiet guardianship. Max barked again, shaking her from her reverie. He was already a few paces ahead, looking back at her expectantly. She stuffed the note into her coat pocket and rose, determination surging through her. "Okay, Max. I trust you." They pressed on, the terrain growing rougher. The trees thickened, their skeletal branches clawing at the night sky. Emily stumbled more than once, her boots slipping on hidden patches of ice, but Max remained steadfast. The dog paused only to sniff the air, as if recalibrating his sense of direction, before bounding forward again. As they continued, Emily's mind returned to George and the mystery surrounding him. She remembered the day, years ago, when George had shown up at her doorstep with an envelope. She had been struggling to make ends meet as a single mother, and the envelope contained just enough money to pay her overdue bills. George had said nothing about it, only that it was the right thing to do. Now, in the shadow of the woods, She wondered if he had foreseen a day like this, a day when Max would guide her towards saving her son. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a clearing ahead. Max halted abruptly, his body stiff, his ears pinned back. Emily shone her flashlight toward the open space, her heart pounding. In the center of the clearing, she spotted something bright against the snow, a patch of blue fabric. "Timmy!" she cried, rushing forward. She fell to her knees, picking up the small winter hat her son had been wearing that morning. The snow around it was disturbed, as though someone, or something, had been there recently. Max sniffed the ground furiously, circling the area before letting out a sharp bark. Emily's chest tightened. "Is he close, Max? Did he come through here?" Max barked again and bolted toward the edge of the clearing, where a faint trail led further into the forest. Emily followed, clutching Timmy's hat like a lifeline. As they descended a slight slope, Emily noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavier, the wind quieter, muffled by the dense canopy above. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Max slowed, his body tense, his movements cautious. Emily tightened her grip on the flashlight, its beam dancing across the trees. Suddenly, Max froze. His tail stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Emily stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. She followed Max's gaze and saw what had triggered his reaction. Faint light flickering in the distance. It was the warm, unnatural glow of a lantern, coming from what appeared to be a small structure, a cabin hidden deep within the woods. Emily's stomach churned. Who would be out here in this weather? And why? Max glanced back at her, his eyes sharp and focused. She could sense his warning, a silent plea for caution. "Is Timmy in there?" she whispered. Her voice wavered, both from the cold and the growing fear that she was about to uncover something far worse than she had imagined. Max didn't move. He seemed to be waiting for her to decide. Emily hesitated, gripping Timmy's hat tightly. The cabin could hold answers, or more danger than she was prepared to face. Either way, she knew there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "Let's go, Max," and stepped toward the flickering light. The cabin stood in eerie defiance of the storm, its weathered wooden walls dimly illuminated by the flicker of a lantern inside. Emily's heart pounded as she approached, her breath visible in the freezing air. Every instinct told her to turn back, but the sight of Timmy's hat clenched in her hand reminded her why she couldn't. Max stayed close to her side, his growl low and steady, a warning that danger was near. Reaching the edge of the clearing, Emily crouched behind a snow-laden bush. She squinted through the storm at the cabin, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The windows were frosted over, but faint movement inside caught her attention. Someone was there. Her stomach churned as she imagined who it might be and what they might want with her son. Max nudged her hand, his nose cold against her glove. He was ready, his muscles taut with focus. Emily nodded. "Okay, boy. Let's find Timmy." They moved cautiously, circling the cabin. Max led the way, his paws silent against the snow despite his size. Emily stayed close, every crunch of her boots sounding deafening in the stillness. When they reached the back of the cabin, they found a small, grimy window. Emily wiped away the frost with her sleeve and peered inside. Her breath caught. There, in the corner of the single room, was Timmy. He was tied to a chair, his face pale but alert. Tears glistened on his cheeks, and his body trembled visibly in the cold. Emily's throat tightened as relief and fear collided. Her son was alive, but for how long? A shadow moved across the room. Emily's eyes darted to the figure pacing near the fireplace. It was a man, older, hunched, with wild, unkempt hair. He muttered to himself, his voice muffled by the thick walls. Emily couldn't make out the words, but his agitated gestures sent a chill through her. Who was he? And why had he taken Timmy? Max growled softly, pulling Emily's attention back. She turned and knelt beside him, gripping his collar. "We need a plan, Max," she whispered, her voice shaking. She glanced at the window again, her mind racing. The man was distracted, but she didn't know for how long. She had to act, and quickly. Emily crept to the front of the cabin, where the door hung slightly ajar. The storm howled around her, but she hardly noticed. Her focus was on Timmy and getting him out safely. She reached for the flashlight on her belt, but stopped herself. A beam of light might give her away. Instead, she took a deep breath and peered through the crack in the door. The man's muttering grew louder, and now she could make out snippets of his words. George, always the hero, always taking what wasn't his. Emily froze. George? What did he have to do with this? Her confusion deepened, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Timmy needed her now. She pushed the door open slowly, inch by inch, until it was wide enough for her and Max to slip inside. The cabin was dimly lit, the lantern casting long shadows across the walls. The man hadn't noticed her yet. He was too engrossed in his angry monologue, his back turned to them. Emily signaled for Max to stay low, and together they moved toward Timmy. The boy's eyes widened when he saw her, and Emily quickly pressed a finger to her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. She crouched beside him, working at the knots that bound his wrists. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, but adrenaline fueled her determination. Timmy whimpered softly, his body shaking with relief. "It's okay, baby," Emily whispered. "We're getting out of here." Suddenly, the man's voice stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily's stomach dropped as she turned her head slowly. He was staring at her. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of rage and something darker, desperation. "This isn't about you. It was never about you." Emily stood, placing herself between the man and Timmy. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's just a boy." The man shook his head violently. "A boy? He's George's legacy, just like that dog. And George ruined everything." Emily's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? George is gone. Whatever he did, gone." The man interrupted, his laughter bitter and sharp. "He's not gone. He's here. In you, in that boy, in that damn dog. George took everything from me, and now it's my turn." Before Emily could respond, the man lunged. Max sprang into action, leaping between them with a ferocious bark. The man stumbled back, startled by the dog's sheer force. Max growled, his teeth bared, his body a shield between Emily and her attacker. "Run, Timmy," Emily shouted, pulling her son to his feet. Timmy hesitated for a split second before bolting for the door. Emily followed, but the man grabbed her arm, pulling her back. She struggled, fear surging through her as his grip tightened. Max lunged again, this time knocking the man to the ground. Emily didn't wait. She ran, grabbing Timmy's hand as they fled into the storm. The snow was blinding, the cold biting, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she heard the sounds of a scuffle, Max's growls and the man's shouts, but she couldn't look back. Her only thought was getting Timmy to safety. They reached the edge of the woods, where the search party had gathered earlier. Emily collapsed to her knees, pulling Timmy into her arms. "You're okay," she sobbed, clutching him tightly. "You're okay, Mom," Timmy whispered, his voice trembling. "Max, where's Max?" Emily's heart sank. She turned toward the woods, her eyes scanning the swirling snow. The sounds of the fight had stopped, replaced by the deafening roar of the wind. Panic gripped her chest. "Max," she called, her voice hoarse. "Max, come back." For what felt like an eternity, there was no response. Then, through the storm, a figure emerged. Max limped toward them, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes tired but triumphant. Emily sobbed with relief as the dog reached her, nuzzling her hand. "You saved us, Max," she whispered. "You saved all of us." The storm raged on, the snow whipping through the trees like a relentless, icy tide. Emily held Timmy tightly as Max collapsed at her side, his breathing heavy but steady. She ran her hands over the dog's fur, searching for injuries. His left flank bore a shallow gash, likely from the struggle in the cabin, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. Emily's relief was palpable, her heart thundering in her chest as she whispered, "You're okay, Max. You're okay." Timmy clung to her, his face buried in her coat. "Mom, why did that man take me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The man's words echoed in her mind. His anger at George, his claim that this was all about the past. But now wasn't the time for explanations. They needed to get back to town, away from the storm and the danger that still lurked in the forest. "We'll talk about it later, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Right now, we need to get you somewhere warm." Max barked once, weakly, then rose to his feet. Emily marveled at his resilience. Even after everything, he was ready to lead again. "Let's go, boy," she said, gripping Timmy's hand as Max started toward the trail. The dog moved slower now, his limp noticeable, but his determination was undiminished. The journey back was grueling. The snow had deepened, and the wind was merciless, slicing through Emily's coat as if it weren't there. Timmy stumbled often, his small legs struggling against the drifts, but Emily kept him upright, whispering encouragement with every step. Max plowed ahead, his instincts guiding them through the labyrinth of trees. As they approached the edge of the forest, Emily heard a noise, a faint rustling, barely audible over the storm. She froze, her grip tightening on Timmy's hand. Max stopped too, his ears swiveling. The rustling grew louder, and then a figure emerged from the trees. It was the man from the cabin. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. The man's face was twisted with fury, his clothes tattered from the scuffle with Max. He held a crude, makeshift club in his hand, a broken tree branch sharpened to a point. "You think you can just leave?" he snarled, his voice raw and guttural. "This isn't over." Emily pushed Timmy behind her, shielding him with her body. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling but firm. Max stepped forward, his growl deep and menacing, though his limp betrayed his exhaustion. The man laughed bitterly. "That dog can't save you now. None of you are leaving these woods." Emily's fear turned to anger. "What did George ever do to you?" she demanded. "Why take this out on a child?" The man's face contorted, his eyes wild. "George took everything from me. My family, my home, my life. It was all because of him. And now, even in death, he's still the hero. Still the one everyone loves." He pointed at Max, his hand shaking. "Even that mutt is part of his legacy." "You're wrong," Emily said, her voice steady now. "George wasn't perfect, but he saved people. He helped this town. And he wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you hurting anyone." The man roared, raising his makeshift weapon. Before Emily could react, Max lunged. The dog's bark was thunderous, cutting through the storm like a battle cry. He collided with the man, knocking him to the ground. They wrestled in the snow, a chaotic blur of fur and flailing limbs. Emily grabbed Timmy and pulled him back, shielding his eyes. "Max!" she cried, her voice breaking. The struggle ended as suddenly as it began. The man lay still, groaning in pain, while Max stood over him, his teeth bared. Blood stained the snow beneath them, but Max didn't press the attack. He simply stood his ground, guarding Emily and Timmy with an unwavering ferocity. Emily moved quickly, grabbing the man's weapon and tossing it into the woods. She tore the scarf from her neck and used it to bind his wrists, her hands shaking as she worked. The man glared at her but didn't resist. His fight was over. The search party found them an hour later. Lanterns bobbed in the distance as voices called Emily's name. Relief flooded her as she waved her arms, shouting for help. The townsfolk swarmed them, pulling Emily and Timmy into warm embraces and wrapping blankets around their shivering bodies. Max received his share of attention too, the townspeople marveling at his bravery. Emily recounted what had happened, her voice steady despite the chaos of the night. The man was taken into custody, his grumbling protests ignored as the townsfolk led him back to town. Emily watched him go, a mixture of pity and relief washing over her. By the time they reached Willow Creek, the storm had begun to wane. The snow still fell, but gently now, and the town glowed with the soft light of Christmas decorations. Emily and Timmy were taken to the church, where the community had gathered to wait for news. The warmth of the room was a stark contrast to the cold outside, and Emily felt her exhaustion melt away as she sank into a chair. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap. Emily stroked his fur, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You saved us, Max," she whispered. "I don't know how, but you did." As the townsfolk gathered around, someone produced a tin box. It was the same one Emily had found in the woods, now cleaned of snow. Inside was George's letter, which Emily read aloud for the first time. "If you're reading this," she began, her voice steady, "then Max has done what I trained him to do. Protect this town and its people. Trust him, because he'll know what to do when the time comes." The room fell silent as she finished. Tears streamed down Emily's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of love. On Christmas morning, Emily and Timmy woke to find Max lying by the fireplace, his eyes bright and watchful. The tree sparkled with lights, and a single wrapped package sat beneath it, a gift George had left for Timmy before he passed. Inside was a small wooden carving of a shepherd dog, intricately detailed and polished to a shine. Timmy held it close, his smile radiant. "Max is our hero," he said, looking at the real-life version lying beside him. Emily nodded, her heart full. "He is." And so was George. As the snow fell gently outside, Emily felt a peace she hadn't known in years. George's legacy wasn't just in the past. It was alive, woven into the fabric of their community, carried forward by Max, and reflected in the love that bound them all together. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.